I don't know how a market can function as a truth-seeking mechanism when it is surveilled top to bottom and all of its participants' actions can be predicted before they happen. I don't see how that market can function as a tool for discovery. And I think that's where I think we're heading with all of this, or at least making a very honest effort to write that.
Welcome to Smarter Markets, a weekly podcast featuring the icons and entrepreneurs of technology, commodities, and finance, ranting on the inadequacies of our systems and riffing on ideas for how to solve them. Together, we examine the questions: are we facing a crisis of information or a crisis of trust? And will building smarter markets be the antidote? This episode is brought to you in part by Abaxx Exchange, bringing better price discovery and risk management tools to navigate today's commodities markets through centrally cleared, physically deliverable futures contracts in energy, environmental, battery materials, and precious metals markets. Smarter markets are here.
Welcome back to Re-engineering Tokenization on Smarter Markets. I'm Dave Greely, Chief Economist at Abaxx Technologies. Our guest today is Ian Forrester, Head of Product at Abaxx Technologies. We'll be picking up where we left off last week and digging in deeper on the use of cryptographically secured identity and signatures to take that next step from digitization to tokenization. And we'll be discussing Abaxx's approach to the 4 pillars supporting trusted commercial transactions: securing identity, intent, assets, and data. Hello, Ian. Welcome back to Smarter Markets.
Hey, Dave, it's great to be here. And I realize of the times I've been on the pod, this is our first time just you and me together, which is an exciting opportunity.
That's terrific. It's just you and me. And I really appreciate you coming back so quickly, coming back this week. It was a really great conversation with you and Josh last week on the podcast, and a great introduction to this podcast series. And last week, Josh noted that digitization has clearly been an ongoing path for decades. And when we talk about tokenization, it's really the next step in that path. And you remarked that it's worth making a distinction between digitization and tokenization, and that when you're talking about tokenization, you're almost universally talking about public key, private key cryptography tools. And I'd like to pick up our conversation this week there, because I feel we need to understand identity and how we demonstrate it online in order to understand how we can trust commercial transactions done in a digital environment. And that's really where we want to be moving to in this series. But before we take that next step into tokenization, I wanted to start our conversation with the idea of identity in the more familiar context where all of us and our listeners are at now digitally. I know for most of us, our digital ID is our email address, and we're all accustomed to demonstrating that it's us by showing that we can receive email at that address. Is that essentially right, the way I put that, in terms of our email address for many of us is essentially our current digital ID? And what are the strengths and weaknesses of that current approach to identity online?
Yeah, I think so. Sort of when we're talking about digital identity, I think it's important to make a couple of distinctions and put some definition around what a digital identity is. Because the truth is that each of us have a multitude of digital identities that get tacked onto us the same way that a farmer tacks an ear tag onto a cow, right? Onto cattle. And this is represented in everything from cookies in your browser to your ISP's routing table. You can sort of think of the internet as a dark forest where platforms are running around sort of sticking air tags to people until they shake them off. And this world of digital identity is full of threads of activity that are tied to identities that exist as random serial numbers in a database somewhere. And I think what we're talking about when we're talking about digital identity are a sort of a high value subset of those identities. And these are way more useful. And they have 3 qualities that I think define them that we can anchor on. The first is that they're persistent, right? So unlike, when you are sort of online and you click a link and you see it has this question mark in it and it says UTM after. You've seen that? So that UTM, that stands for Urchin Tracking Module. And this is like one of those cattle tags. Oh, it's ephemeral, right? It sort of exists in your browser for as long as you use that link and then it goes away. But it helps ad platforms like Google and Facebook track provenance and user behavior across different domains. And I think that's important, right? That's what we're kind of looking for here is how can you track or how can you log activity across different domains? But, just for sort of practical takeaway from this podcast, if you take nothing else away, you can go ahead and delete all that stuff, right? Like anything after the question mark, go ahead and delete it. Do yourself and your friends a favor. That's an example of a digital identity that's not really persistent, right? It doesn't persist with the user. So we want digital identities that are persistent. Those three characteristics that define this high value subset are that those identities are persistent. The subject of the identity can prove they control it, so they can prove control over it, and they're portable. That means that they can be used across different domains. And it turns out that email is a great way to anchor those qualities, right? It's widely assumed to be adopted, secure, available. And for anyone who's downloaded Verifier Plus and created an identity using ID++ and using that app, they can tell you that we're using that same familiar standard in our own system. I think what's different about what we're doing is what happens on top of that email alias. So we think of the email address as an alias. It's a way to prove control. IDPs like Google do the same thing. And then what's sort of, I think, under the hood and part of the plumbing is that those IDPs, they give you an identity, right? They give you another identity on top of that email address. Because while email is a great way to prove control, it's also not totally unique. Email addresses can be reused, et cetera, et cetera. So in and of itself, it's not like a UUID or a serial number or, a DID, right? But it's a helpful alias and it's a way to sort of prove control. What happens after the email address is, I think, the important part because when Google gives you a number, that number becomes your identity. And when you want to use that identity in another platform, you basically have to phone home to Google, right? That other platform that you're logging into has to give Google a call and say, "Hey, is this one yours?" And they say, "Yep." And then Google marks it in their book. Oh, this person logged into here, or oh, they did this, or oh, they used us here. Okay. And then sort of along you go on your way. I think the opportunity with decentralized identity is to remove that need to phone home, right? So by creating or sort of by using PKI, which is the abbreviation for public key infrastructure and the abbreviation for the stand in for public key, private key cryptography, by using PKI to prove control over an identity, we can sort of cut that phone home out of the loop, right? The DID is persistent. It's not reliant on a central system to maintain its integrity. And a digital signature can be used to prove control over it. So there's really no need for that phone home. The authentication does not require Daddy Google to approve it. It can be approved between two parties bilaterally. And I think that's a key intersection of where it becomes useful in markets.
Yeah, and I'd love to dig into that a little bit more, but I want to come back to something you said. This is really interesting when you referred to the email address as an alias, and then there is an actual equivalent of a serial number or a social security number that the email provider has. Use Google as an example, but I would never know it existed. I would never know what that was. Is that right?
Yeah, and you can't directly prove control over it. You need Google to prove control over it. I'm picking on Google, but this is how all these systems work, right? Like any identity provider, you're sort of trusting them to prove control on your behalf. And DID stands for decentralized identity. With decentralized identity, I think the exciting thing is the ability to you yourself prove control over it without anybody else's permission, right? Without having to rely on that central counterparty.
Right. And let's take that next step then into tokenization and public key, private key cryptography. First, in layperson's terms, so talk to me like I'm a first grader here. What is public key, private key cryptography, and how do we use it to create this new form of digital identity?
Basically, the history of it, it's nothing new. It was first created in the 1970s. In fact, we're coming up on the 50th anniversary of Diffie and Hellman's paper that they published at Stanford in 1976, detailing the implementation of the first public key, private key protocol. And today we use it as it is the foundation of trust and security online. You see in the browser HTTPS, that little S. So that S means that there is a certificate somewhere that is signed from the publisher of this web page that they are accountable for it. And they have done that signature, they've signed that certificate using public key, private key cryptography. So each of us is benefiting from it every day. And I think what's interesting in terms of the opportunity ahead is to take that same sort of signature scheme and use it in more day to day commerce, sort of scale that out. So I think that is to say that it's proven. In terms of how it works, basically it's skipping all the math. It's two keys, a public key, which can be shared with the world. And you can think of this as the address to your PO box. It's your PO box number. And then there's a private key. And you can think of this as the key to the PO box, right? So anybody can use your public key to send you mail, but only you can use your private key to get the mail. And when I say only you, I think that's a really important aspect here and something that we've spent a lot of time on. How do we ensure that control of the private key remains with the rightful party? And because really it's the controller of that private key who sort of this is the key to the castle, right? This is the key to everything related to that identity. Anything that gets built on top of that identity is subject to that private key. And the way that the keys work is that they're linked by math, by algorithms, so that the public key can be derived from the private key, but not the other way around. And that's where we get that number two on the list of identity requirements, the proof of control, right? Through the exercise of that private key. And that exercise is typically known as signing. Cryptographic signatures or signing is how that private key is exercised.
I just want to make sure people don't get confused since we were talking about email addresses a moment before. So, when thinking of the public key and the private key, they're both basically numbers or strings of numbers and letters, correct? And so, if I have a private key, I can encrypt a message that I send to you. And if you have the public key, you can decrypt it and read it. And the same in reverse. If you have the public key, you could send me a message encrypted with the public key, and only I with the private key could read it.
Yeah. What you're quoting there are some really well known cryptographic signing protocols. So, this is where we get into what's a protocol? It's a way of doing something, right? It's an agreed upon method of taking an action. You do step one, step two, step three, step four. That's the protocol. So, with a cryptographic signing protocol, you're absolutely right. You would sign using your private key. I would decode that encrypted signature using your public key.
Could you walk us through like an actual signing message that you send? To me, that's new relative to, say, an email.
First, I'm going to start with a story. So, in the 80s and 90s, the rock band Van Halen, there was this rumor going around that they were big divas because part of their contract when they showed up to do a live show was that they had to have a bowl of brown M&Ms in their dressing room. And the rumor was that they were big divas, but the truth of it was that they were the first rock show with a huge setup that included a lot of pyro, and they were playing venues like the Electric Factory in Philadelphia, which I think you and I are both familiar with, Dave. And that's a small venue, and you can get really hurt if some pyro goes wrong there. So, buried in their rider, they had this clause that said you had to put a bowl of brown M&Ms in the dressing room. And this became their canary in the coal mine, right? It was their shorthand to see if somebody had actually read the rider so that the pyro was set up correctly and Eddie Van Halen wouldn't get lit on fire, right? And that was their shorthand. If there wasn't a bowl of brown M&Ms in the dressing room, they said, hey, look, we're not going on stage until literally everything is checked, which can take hours and delay the show. I say that in the context because a hashing function is sort of at the root of all this. The way that a signed message is sent is that first that message goes through a hashing function. And this is like a one-way transmogrifier from Calvin and Hobbes, right? Where like the message goes into the box and it comes out totally unrecognizable. And you can't reverse engineer. You can't go backwards from a hash message to the original, but you can put the same message in and get the same result. So it's consistent. And so what happens is the sender will hash the message and then they will encrypt that hash using their private key. And that's sort of the signature. And then they'll send that package. They'll send the original message along with the signature, which is the hash that's encrypted with their private key. The receiver will then, they'll receive that package. They will hash the message again on their side to get their result. And then they'll decrypt the signature from the sender using their public key. And then they'll compare the hashes. And it's like the brown M&Ms, right? If the hashes match, then the brown M&Ms are in the dressing room and everything's good. If the hashes don't match, then you know that there's something fraudulent going on and not to trust the message. And so that's, I think, how a signed message works, right? And sort of fundamentally how digital signature works too.
And that's simple, but very powerful, right? Because it's conveyed a lot of information in a small number of steps. You've got the unencrypted message that you received, which you could read, fine, just send over email, whatever. But you know that the message that you can read hasn't been altered from the message that was originally sent. So you know it's the same message that you got that the receiver sent. So it hasn't been manipulated en route. You also know that it was sent by that particular signer. So you've kind of connected back to them. And then you also get some measure of intent. Like they took a number of steps to get this to you. So they meant to send it to you and they meant it to be that document. So you've actually conveyed a lot of information that's necessary to trust the message in a pretty small number of steps.
Exactly. And we think of those along sort of three lines. One, authenticity. You sort of rightly stated the signature is the attestation from the control of that private key that the message originated with them. It's an authentic message. The integrity of the message. Packets get lost, data gets corrupted. How do you know that this is a full and complete record of that signer's intent? Well, because you have the hash and you can verify that, yes, this was the complete message. And then non-repudiation. And I think this one's incredibly important for our use cases and markets because that signature lives with the record. The holders of that record have proof that the signer can't repudiate those claims later. And I think that goes back to what you were saying about intent. I know we're going to talk about the four pillars of a transaction, but repudiation and recharacterization are two very pernicious challenges when it comes to digitizing and tokenizing assets and kind of moving the world of money online. Because without digital signatures and cryptographically secure digital signatures, so much can sort of fall under those buckets of recharacterization.
Where you could just walk away and say, well, no, I never sent that message.
Yeah, I actually had this experience when I was running my last company. I had a big contract that was going to come through for this agency. It was in the sort of marketing technology world, and I had to hire very quickly to get this project done. And it wasn't sure if the project was coming through or not coming through, but I was in a position where I had to commit funds right away. And the head of the other company signed. I got the DocuSign that this thing was signed. And so I started spending money. And then a week later, she came back and said, oh no, I never signed that. My assistant signed it on my behalf. That's not a genuine signature. We're not moving this thing forward. And I was like, I was in a really tough position. So these things do have real world consequences. That was a case where she was able to repudiate her signature because it wasn't done in a secure way.
maybe we need to get to this later after we've laid a little bit more groundwork, but how do you avoid repudiation with digital identities or decentralized identities?
I mean, the most important thing, and this is why we've spent a long time with the Verifier Plus app. The most important thing is ensuring a solid connection between the person and the act of signing. And we have this in the real world. The other thing is none of this is new. We're simply doing our best to model in the digital space what we already trust in the analog space. I have sort of an unofficial motto that I don't really share with people, but I'll tell you and our listeners, which is make the internet paper again. How do you take the secure and verifiable and provably scarce qualities of paper that have built so much of, and honestly, data preservation? I mean, papers have been a great medium for preserving data over the centuries. How do you take those qualities and move them into digital space such that we can preserve those tenets of analog real world deal making in and among the dark forest of the internet? That's the challenge. No small feat, but that's the challenge that I think us and everybody working in the space is really trying to tackle. So again, it goes back to, how do you tie back to that person? How do you take the action of signing, this thing that we do with our hands, and put it in a digital space? And, I think 20 years ago, there wasn't really an answer for this. These days, though, we all have this incredibly secure, highly personalized cryptographic signing device in our pockets. For us, it's through the Verifier Plus app. For instance, when we do document signatures, we require a multi-factor authentication on device through Verifier Plus. So that's how a signature gets done. It's through proving control at the time of signature using that sort of secure pipeline that we build through Verifier Plus to the cryptographic material.
And this opens the door to many other use cases, right? From verifiable credentials to placing identity on data, not just people. And I was hoping, Ian, maybe you could walk us through one or two of these use cases and why they're so important.
Absolutely. I think what's important is that from a foundation of authenticity, integrity, and non repudiation, this allows us to build abstractions and assign information that can be very, very helpful. So, one example, a really good example, is a verifiable credential. What is a verifiable credential? Well, fundamentally, it's a token that has within it claims that are being made about a subject, which could be a digital identity, by an issuer of that credential. And that issuer is signing these claims. The well-worn example is a university degree, right? Once you get your degree from a university, it's very unlikely that somebody's going to take that away from you. So a university can issue that degree as a verifiable credential and make the claims that this person completed this course of study and here's all the evidence for it, and put that all in a machine readable format and sign it, right? And so now when that person shows up to me and says, I went to Northwestern University, or I went to University of Chicago, then they can present that evidence to me as a verifiable credential. And as long as I trust the signature, or as long as I trust the identity of the issuer, that this is a genuine issuer, then I don't have to call Northwestern or U Chicago and say, hey, did this person really go here? I don't have to have them check their records because they signed it. I trust their signature. And so now I can start to interact with people bilaterally using third party information that's been signed and attested to, right? As long as I trust the signature, I can trust the information. As long as I can trust the information, I can interact with this party based on that information without anybody else having to know, right? Without having to call a third party, without having to call Daddy Google, without having to independently verify and somehow dox myself that I'm engaging in this transaction or engaging in this interaction with a person.
And so it's a little bit like making, as you said earlier, making the internet paper again, right? Because now you and I could meet. You might not know me. I could say I'm going in for a job interview, right? I can pull out my driver's license And that's issued by the state of Connecticut and signed by the state of Connecticut that says, hey, this is Dave. Here's his picture. This is where he lives. Here's his birthday. Could pull out my passport from the US government, another signed document. I could pull out my degree from college. I could do all these things and I could show you the paper, but now I could present that to you in a digital format and you would be able to check it without having to talk to the state of Connecticut or the US government or the University of Chicago or what have you.
Exactly. And so we're sort of taking the best of that paper-based technology, and then because it's digital, we can add to it where, "Hey, you're Dave, you wanna prove to me that you went to the University of Chicago, but for some reason, you don't wanna tell me what year you graduated." Well, if you're showing me your degree, I'm gonna see that information, right? If you're showing me the paper degree, but because you can show this information to me using a signed presentation, you have the opportunity to pick and choose which data you show me. You have the opportunity to, using zero knowledge proof, say, hey, you're asking me this question that's a yes no question. I'm going to reference the data that supports my answer of yes or no and provide you a yes no answer that you can trace back to the verifiable credential without seeing what that answer is, right? So there's all sorts of ways that we can use this to not only accelerate the what we can already do on paper, but actually add these capabilities around privacy to keep interactions on a need to know basis.
It also raises the idea, too, that you can raise the level of proof depending on the level of trust required for that transaction you're entering into, right? Like there could be one level of transaction where, hey, I just want something equivalent to like knowing it's you. Maybe that's the driver's license. There could be others where, oh, I want a lot more layers of trust. I want more third party endorsements. Maybe even before the driver's license, it's just somebody we both know saying, yeah, that's Dave. But I feel like in kind of the current environment, things are often very binary, right? You have control of the email address or you don't. And that might be fine for certain degrees of transactions. For others, you might want a lot more proof about who this person is and what they're capable of, and from maybe higher trust third parties kind of vouching for them.
Well, yeah, and I think you hit the nail on the head with the third parties because that's how 90% of information online is validated through trust in third parties. And I think this really limits our ability to create transparent functioning markets that are based in technology. Because if you always have someone else in the room watching you transact simply because you're using their platform, if the data around a transaction is trusted because it is held by DocuSign, should be unrelated third party, what happens is this third party sort of gets put right at the center of each transaction. And then we've seen this happen in other markets and advertising media. And I think commodities markets participants are smart enough to have seen this trend and say, no, no, thank you. We're not going to do that. We're not going to give technology provider perfect knowledge over our market activities because what inevitably ends up happening is that technology provider at scale becomes the most important person in the conversation, right? Google and Facebook have edged out advertising and media companies and sort of created this barbell effect where because they're in the room for so many of the transactions, there's no competing with them, right? You have this sort of monopoly power. And it's not because either of the founders were incredible media creators or publishers or advertisers. It's simply because they controlled the venue and the source of truth.
There's a lot of the ideas that are floating around in this conversation. I'd love to kind of bring them to a focus and really talk about how we use these to do real important commercial transactions, ones where things are at stake. We've talked about digital identity, the ability to cryptographically sign a message, and want to see how that kind of all comes together. And I know you've talked about your approach in terms of the four pillars of a transaction. Oh, somebody could walk us through those pillars and why that approach and why those pillars.
Yeah, and I think that's a great place to anchor. So when looking at how we apply these systems that use cryptography to make information portable and trusted no matter the domain, when we look at how to replicate instruments that confer ownership based on identity versus possession, and when we look at aligning this with the market and with the use cases in our markets, I think we have to look at it. We sort of have broken it down on four axes, which we're calling the four pillars of a transaction. And this is for any transaction, right? Sort of scales, but certainly gets more important as the stakes get higher. And those four pillars are secure identity. You have to be secure in who you're dealing with, right? You can't have a transaction with one person and then midway they switch to a different person. That doesn't work, right? You need to have a consistent, secure identity throughout the transaction. The intent has to be secure and the data has to be secure. And I'm sort of bunching these together because they are related. So transactions are all about intent at the time of transaction. You have to make sure that what you intend to happen is what's actually happening, and what you're agreeing to is what you're actually agreeing to. And then your counterparty needs to make sure that whatever you've agreed to, and we've talked about this several times, you can't just say like, oh, well, I didn't say that, or I didn't sign that, or oh, my assistant signed that because they had my DocuSign login or something, right? Like, so that intent has to be secure both during the transaction and after. And this is, I think, one of the biggest pieces because recharacterization and repudiation, if the system allows for those things, then it's not a useful system. Nobody can really rely on it, especially as the stakes get higher. So the tools that communicate that intent have to be secure. They can't be corrupted. And then this is where secure data comes into play. The record of that intent must be stored alongside the transaction and the transaction data. And that data must also be secure. And then obviously you have to have a secure asset. And that's where I think we can rely on, and certainly many firms who are approaching this are relying on existing infrastructure, BNY Mellon, the sort of network of asset custodians and warehouses that currently exist. You have to be able to work with those systems, with those stakeholders. So that's the four axes. And then how do we sort of bring that all together so that each of those pillars can be secured by the signature, so that that digital signature that we place so much on can function as the anchor, as the trust anchor for each of these four pillars. That's really how we're approaching this build out with our various tools and APIs and workflows.
And how difficult is it to get the signature at the center and to have the signature accomplish so many important tasks that it secures the identity, the intent, the asset, and the data?
Well, I'm not going to say it's easy. It certainly take a while to sort of figure out and build out each of those pillars, but fortunately there is a lot of prior art that we can draw on. And I think that's important because if we were up here doing something entirely new that had no relationship to anything existing, that would be very difficult to trust. You would need a decade of burn in before anybody could use it for anything. I think what's important that we're doing is we're looking at, okay, what are the absolute tried and true trust methods of working in that dark forest of the internet? What has been working for 50 years, for decades and decades? How do we combine these things in a novel way using advents like massive mobile phone adoption, right? And acceptance of sort of mobile phone as a proxy for the body taking an action, the same way that a physical signature is. The ways that we combine those things becomes very important. And also, I think a lot of fun because we get to see what works. And people sort of say, what is the ID++ protocol? That's what it is, right? It's the protocol that defines all of those interactions and the steps for doing these things.
Well, thanks, Ian. I appreciate you having this conversation because I know you're working on many deeply technological issues, and it's not always easy to express it as succinctly and at the first grader level and a relatable way that you have today. So I appreciate that. I know it's not an easy thing to do. I know you've got your head down working on a lot of next steps in the process. You've got a whole program of digital title pilots that you're conducting at Abaxx. But if you could lift your head up for a moment as we close out, kind of like to just leave it with, if you think about where all those steps are leading, kind of like what's the North Star that is keeping you on your path? And if you'd look down the road and said, hey, if in whatever number of years I look back and the way we did things was different, you'd feel good about what you had accomplished. What's that North Star that you're moving towards?
Well, I think it comes back to my personal North Star and the North Star for Abaxx are incredibly aligned. And what it comes back to is the ideas of freedom, permissionless action in our digital space, as well as personal property, and specifically personal property protected by the Fourth Amendment in digital space, are almost non existent the way that things have been organized up to this point. Sort of my personal mission is to restore those things. I think that we would have a better, just everybody would have a better time if that's the world we lived in. I think where that meets up with Abaxx is that we fundamentally believe in markets and markets as a way to discover the truth about something. That process of discovery requires that same level of agency and privacy and sort of control over one's information and sort of effects, right? In order to work. I think basically for markets to work, they must be free. And when we look at the trends around digitization and sort of the move towards electronic markets, what we see are a lot of central choke points, or sort of said earlier, the daddy Googles. We see these companies that are really on a mission around creating perfect information and perfect visibility, creating the panopticon where they sit in the middle and see everything that's going on. And I just don't know how a market can function as a truth seeking mechanism when it is surveilled top to bottom and all of its participants' actions can be predicted before they happen. I don't see how that market can function as a tool for discovery. And I think that's where I think we're heading with all of this, or at least making a very honest effort to write that.
Thanks again to Ian Forrester, Head of Product at Abaxx Technologies. We hope you enjoyed the episode. We'll be back next week with another episode of Re-engineering Tokenization. We hope you'll join us.
This episode is brought to you in part by Abaxx Exchange, bringing better price discovery and risk management tools to navigate today's commodities markets through centrally cleared, physically deliverable futures contracts in energy, environmental, battery materials, and precious metals markets. Smarter Markets are here. Contact sales at abaxx.exchange to get started. That concludes this week's episode of Smarter Markets by Abaxx. For episode transcripts and additional episode information, including research, editorial, and video content, please visit smartermarkets.media. Please help more people discover the podcast by leaving a review on Apple Podcast, Spotify, YouTube, or your favorite podcast platform. Smarter Markets is presented for informational and entertainment purposes only. The information presented on Smarter Markets should not be construed as investment advice. Always consult a licensed investment professional before making investment decisions. The views and opinions expressed on Smarter Markets are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect those of the show's hosts or producer. Smarter Markets, its hosts, guests, employees, and producer, Abaxx Technologies, shall not be held liable for losses resulting from investment decisions based on informational viewpoints presented on Smarter Markets. Thank you for listening, and please join us again next week.